If you studied American cruisers at all, you'll have come across an interesting name. USS Canberra CA-70. That ship followed the American naming scheme for cruisers, being named for a city. However, that name seems a bit off. There aren't any American cities named Canberra. The reason this seems odd is fairly simple. USS Canberra is not named for a town or city. She's named in honor of the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, which is, I suppose, a roundabout way of being named for the Australian capital. But the American ship is named after her Australian counterpart, not the city. This curiosity came about because of the Battle of Savo Island. At that action, 4 Allied cruisers were lost, 3 New Orleans-class ships, along with 1 Australian ship, the aforementioned HMAS Canberra. That ship had fought so hard that in the aftermath of her sinking, President Roosevelt chose to honor the ship and her crew. Thus, you saw USS Pittsburgh, then under construction, renamed to USS Canberra, creating the unique case of an American cruiser sharing the name of a foreign capital city. She would already be interesting enough for this. Over the course of her service, Canberra would honor her namesake. This ship suffered some pretty serious damage, but refused to sink. And she would ultimately survive not just into the Cold War, but almost to the very end. Canberra was only decommissioned in 1970, and she wasn't scrapped until 1980. Not to mention, she managed to earn 7 battle stars, despite a late start and an early exit from the Pacific War. So, with all of this in mind, you can see why I've chosen to cover this ship. Something that will begin with her construction as always. This began on September 3rd, 1941 at the Four Rivers Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. Only a couple months before Pearl Harbor in December 1941 drew the United States into the war. At this point, the then Pittsburgh was just another Baltimore-class cruiser. Those ships displaced 13,600 tons at their standard loading, with the full load going up to 17,000 or so tons, notably larger than the treaty-era cruisers. That said, the ships didn't see a noted increase in their main battery. They still retain the same 3 turrets, carrying the same 9, 8-inch, or 203mm guns, and in the same layout of a super-firing pair on the bow and a single turret on the stern. The secondary battery was improved. 12 5-inch, 127mm guns and 6 twin mounts, 1 behind the bow turrets and 1 ahead of the stern turret, with the other 4 on the broadside. Meanwhile, dedicated anti-aircraft weaponry came from a mix of 20mm cannon and 40mm guns, while armor protection was also relatively thick. Baltimore had a main belt that ranged from 4 to 6 inches, 102 to 152 millimeters in thickness. Which brings us to the final note on the design in the form of its speed. This came out to 33 knots on 120,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts. Pretty standard for an American cruiser by this point. Now, with all that covered, let's leave the design and return to Canberra's service. As I said, this began under the name Pittsburgh. That much was normal. The decision by President Roosevelt to honor HMAS Canberra was not. The Australian ship and her crew were certainly hard fighters. It was still quite unusual to name an American ship in their honor. Nonetheless, it was done. Pittsburgh was renamed on October 16, 1942. and launched on April 19, 1943, with the ship commissioned on October 14th as USS Canberra. For the rest of 1943, the cruiser would linger in the Atlantic and Caribbean for the usual shakedown cruise. As a result, she would only sail for the Pacific on January 14, 1944, escorted by USS Norman Scott, another ship with a name related to Guadalcanal, and another one I've covered before. As for Canberra, she arrived at San Diego on January 26th, picked up 634 passengers, and sailed on for Pearl Harbor, arriving there on February 1st for training exercise. Though this was more refresher training than anything else, and she was off for the front line by February 10th, with Canberra joining the screen of USS Saratoga at Kwajalein on February 14th. At this point, the cruiser began the usual pattern for an American warship by this stage of the war. She escorted Saratoga for a week as the carrier launched strikes on Eniwetok from February 16th to the 28th. After this, there was a short period in dock before covering a different carrier for more airstrikes. This time USS Lexington, while the targets were Palau and Yap on March 30th. Canberra would then continue her streak of famous aircraft carriers, escorting both Lexington and Enterprise for airstrikes on Hollandia on April 21st, followed by strikes on Truk on the 29th. All of this was pretty typical duty. The same also went for April 30th, when Canberra and other cruisers bombarded Satawan Island. That side note aside, Canberra was still escorting the carriers, including the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th of 1944. Canberra would provide effective anti-aircraft fire during this, in addition to picking up stranded pilots when American aviators returned from their night attacks on June 20th. After this, it was back to the usual escort duty. In this role, Canberra supported the carriers in strikes on the Philippines, along with Okinawa and Formosa. This continued from August through October, aside from breaks in dock. Unfortunately, that final target, modern Taiwan, would be when she exited the war early. This attack went in on October 13th, 1944. Later that day, 8 Japanese torpedo bombers attacked the American formation. Canberra would be hit by one torpedo on the starboard side, just below the armor, and more critically, between her number 3 and 4 fire room. 23 men were lost, while 4,500 tons of water flooded the ship. Canberra's crew fought the flooding and kept their cruiser afloat. Even so, she had to be towed from the combat zone by Wichita, at least until a proper fleet tug could arrive on the 15th. Canberra was towed out of the combat area along with the similarly crippled Houston. A further attack on October 16th damaged the light cruiser, but Canberra avoided any damage. At this point, further scares aside, the cruiser left the war. She was towed off for repairs, arriving at Ulithi on October 27th. After emergency repair work, Canberra left on November 10th. She would then arrive at Sea Adler Harbor on November 17th, though she had to wait to enter dry dock until December 1st of 1944. Following repairs there, the cruiser left under her own power on January 13th of 1945, eventually returning all the way to Boston by January 27th, where she would remain for repairs until October 1945. As such, she missed the rest of the war, and would, in fact, be put into reserve on March 7th, 1947. Within 5 years, the cruiser was pulled out of reserve. And not just that, she became the second guided missile cruiser in American service. On January 4th, 1952, USS Canberra shifted from CA-70 to CAG-2. Soon after, she was towed off to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard for an extensive overhaul. This saw the aft 8-inch turret removed and replaced by 2 dual-arm Terrier launchers. In addition, the aft 5-inch gun mount was also removed. Similarly, the aft superstructure was completely replaced, while the bridge was modified with new electronics to support the missiles. While not quite as noticeable at first, the ship also lost a funnel. Canberra went from 2 relatively slim stacks to 1 larger trunked funnel. Beyond this, the cruiser retained her original weaponry. Both the bow turrets were still in place, and she also retained 5 of her twin 5-inch mounts. This refit ran from early 1952 through June 1956, a lengthy affair, though also an experimental one. The Navy hadn't quite committed to missiles yet. That would come with the more extensive and frankly less attractive Albany. As for Canberra, she was recommissioned on June 15, 1956. She missed the Korean War due to this refit, but she wouldn't have had much to do there anyway. Instead, she would spend the rest of 1956 and into early 1957 testing those new missiles. As a result, she didn't properly rejoin service until February of 1957, though even then, the early part of that year was spent mostly on training duty, with 2 high-profile exceptions. First, carrying President Eisenhower to a conference in Bermuda from March 14th through March 20th. Then in June, she carried the Secretary of Defense for an international naval review at Hampton Roads. That came on June 12, 1957. Then it was training duty for the rest of summer until September 3rd. At this point, Canberra sailed off to Europe, first for a NATO exercise, Operation Strikeback, and then for service with the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. In either case, fairly typical peacetime duty for the early Cold War, something that would continue into 1958, at which point the cruiser had a much more important duty. On May 26, 1958, USS Canberra rendezvoused with USS Blandy and USS Boston. Those 2 ships transferred the caskets of the unknown soldiers of the European theater, the Pacific theater, and the Korean War. Aboard Canberra, the choice was made on which of the 2 World War II caskets would be the unknown soldier for that war. Once this choice was made, that casket and the Korean War one were sent to Blandy to be taken to Washington, D.C. The remaining casket, meanwhile, was buried at sea with full honors. Following this, Canberra rounded off the 1950s on a return to typical peacetime work, training and patrol either off the American coast or with the 6th Fleet. While full of plenty of port visits, it was largely uneventful, something that continued into the early part of the 1960s. Canberra would perform an around-the-world cruise on March 3, 1960. This saw the cruiser reach Australia on May 2nd, where the Australians could look over the ship honoring their fallen cruiser, including during a commemoration of the Battle of the Coral Sea. After this was done, Canberra sailed on to Japan, arriving there on May 30th. She would spend a few days sailing with the 7th Fleet before continuing on the world tour, with this ultimately concluding upon return to Boston on October 14th of 1960. At this point, it was back to training, something that lasted until May 17, 1961. Canberra then underwent a 4-month overhaul, with the cruiser back in service by September, though this was more in line with the late 1950s, at least at first. By October 1962, things would change. Canberra was assigned to support the blockade of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fortunately, even this was mostly quiet for the cruiser. When that blockade came to an end in November 1962, Canberra returned to peacetime work, ultimately shifting back to the Pacific for the first proper time since World War II in 1963, with the cruiser, after another refit, properly returning to service in October of 1964. Soon after, at the start of 1965, she returned to combat. On January 29th, she arrived off the coast of North Vietnam. For 27 days, Canberra provided anti-aircraft cover for the carriers. Once more back to her old duty, if not her old stomping grounds. She would do much the same in March 1965 after a short overhaul. However, the more notable work wouldn't come until May, when Canberra performed 6 fire support missions, the first time an American cruiser had fired her guns in anger since the Korean War. Canberra would earn a medal for her performance off Vietnam when she returned to San Diego on July 7th. By February 1966, Canberra would return to Vietnam. Her big guns were considered a very valuable asset for engaging shore targets. Accurate, fast-firing, and hard-hitting. Certainly longer ranged and harder hitting than the various destroyers. She would continue on this valuable duty until May of 1966, and following an overhaul and training period, she was right back to it by October. Canberra would spend late October and early November firing some 4,000 rounds at shore targets. This continued into January of 1967, when she covered amphibious landings, from January 3rd to the 15th of 1967. Similar duty would follow after a short refit in February, with Canberra receiving shore fire from North Vietnamese forces in March. 2 times the ship was hit directly, though this was ineffective. No lasting damage was done, nor were any crew lost. Only 1 sailor was even seriously wounded, with the man evacuated to a hospital ashore. Ultimately, she left Vietnam on March 22nd, for an overhaul period, followed by memorial services off Salvo Island on April 26th, and another Coral Sea celebration in Australia, specifically Melbourne, in early May. After this, it was back home to California for a short refit period. Canberra would be right back to Vietnam by November 1967. The ship was in very high demand indeed, 5 to 10 gunfire missions a day. This lasted until January 1968, at which point she sailed to Japan for a break. A break that was cut short on January 27th due to the seizure of USS Pueblo by North Korea. Canberra joined other American forces should a greater conflict break out. That wouldn't happen, of course, and the cruiser was back to Vietnam by mid-February, due to the Tet Offensive breaking out at the same time. In particular, Canberra fired some 3,000 rounds over 5 days to support the defense of Hue, with the cruiser being fired upon by a shore battery on February 27, 1968. This did minimal damage, though Canberra's return fire wiped out the battery. Following this, she spent March through April firing nearly 17,000 rounds ashore. It should be little surprise that Canberra was awarded another medal upon returning to San Diego on April 29th. Soon after this, on May 1st, 1968, she reverted to the old CA-70 designation, a recognition of how much her guns were the main focus. Unsurprisingly, she was back to Vietnam by October 1968 in a reflection of this, although that would prove to be her final gunline period. Canberra remained off Vietnam until the start of January 1969. After this, she sailed back to California. Refit would follow, along with training duty, with her Terrier missiles removed on July 1st to be replaced by chaff rocket launchers. However, Canberra's days were numbered. On August 22, 1969, she got word that the cruiser was going to be decommissioned, which came on February 2, 1970, with the ship ultimately scrapped in July 1980. She had quite the lengthy and successful career, especially off Vietnam. Not bad for a ship that's often overlooked. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.